Sometimes the greatest miracle in your life arrives looking like someone everyone else has already given up on. The rain had settled over downtown Portland like a quiet confession, turning the streets into ribbons of reflected light beneath rows of glowing storefronts. Most people hurried toward warm cars and dry apartments, their footsteps quick, their eyes fixed ahead, too busy to notice the woman sitting alone on a stone planter outside an upscale rooftop lounge. Ethan Walker noticed. He always noticed. After 12 hours at his neighborhood auto garage, his hands still carried the faint scent of motor oil despite washing them twice before locking up. His old pickup rumbled steadily through the wet streets, its heater working just well enough to chase away the chill. All he wanted was to get home before his 10-year-old daughter, Lily, woke long enough to ask if he had remembered the blueberry pancakes he had promised for Saturday morning. Since losing his wife 8 years earlier, promises had become sacred. He had learned that life could steal almost everything from a man except the choice to keep his word. As he stopped at a red light, movement near the entrance of the lounge caught his attention. A woman in an elegant navy business suit stumbled slightly as two impatient guests brushed past her without a second glance. She wasn't loud. She wasn't causing trouble. She simply looked exhausted, as though the weight of the entire week had settled onto her shoulders all at once. Ethan watched as she searched inside her purse for a phone that wasn't there, sighed quietly, then rested her face in both hands. The light turned green, but he didn't press the gas pedal. Something about her reminded him of the loneliness he used to see in the mirror after Emily died. Quiet pain recognized quiet pain. He eased his truck toward the curb and stepped into the cool night air. "Ma'am?" he asked gently, keeping a respectful distance. "Are you okay?" She slowly lifted her head. Her makeup had begun to fade from the rain, and her blue eyes struggled to focus. "I think," she whispered with an embarrassed smile, "I think I made a terrible decision tonight." Ethan offered a reassuring nod instead of judgment. "Do you have someone I can call?" She searched her pockets again before giving a tiny shake of her head. "Phone's gone. Wallet too. At least, I can't find them." A silence settled between them, filled only by distant traffic and the soft tapping of rain against the sidewalk. Ethan glanced toward the lounge entrance, expecting someone to come looking for her, but no one did. Whoever she had arrived with had already disappeared into the city. "My name's Ethan," he said calmly. "I can drive you somewhere safe if you'd like. A hotel. Your home. Anywhere you remember." She studied his face longer than he expected, almost as if measuring whether kindness like his still existed. Finally she nodded once. "Charlotte," she answered softly. "My name is Charlotte." As Ethan opened the passenger door of his aging pickup, neither of them noticed the small silver locket slipping from Charlotte's coat pocket onto the worn floor mat below. And hidden inside that forgotten locket was a photograph that would soon connect 3 generations through a truth neither of them could have imagined. The drive across the city was wrapped in quiet, broken only by the steady rhythm of rain against the windshield and the soft hum of the old pickup truck's engine. Charlotte rested her head against the passenger window, her eyes closing for a few seconds before opening again as though she were trying to remember where she belonged. Ethan kept both hands on the steering wheel and his attention on the road. He had learned long ago that kindness did not require curiosity. If someone trusted you in their weakest moment, the least you could do was protect their dignity. After a few miles Charlotte spoke again, her voice barely louder than the rain. "I think my apartment is on Harbor Avenue." Ethan glanced toward her without taking his eyes off traffic for more than a heartbeat. "Do you know the building number?" She frowned gently and gave a small laugh that carried more embarrassment than amusement. "I wish I did." Ethan smiled politely. "Then we will figure it out together." She looked at him with quiet surprise. Most people she met expected quick answers. Immediate decisions, perfect confidence. This stranger seemed perfectly comfortable with patience. The city lights reflected across the wet pavement as they reached Harbor Avenue. Modern apartment towers lined the street, each entrance glowing beneath warm golden lights. Ethan slowed his truck. "Do any of these look familiar?" Charlotte studied each building carefully. Finally, she pointed toward a glass tower overlooking the river. That one. Ethan parked near the entrance and stepped out into the rain before opening her door with calm courtesy. The doorman hurried outside, his expression shifting from concern to visible relief the moment he recognized Charlotte. "Miss Hayes," he said quickly, "we have been trying to reach you for hours." Charlotte blinked, looking almost confused by the attention. "I am sorry," she answered softly. "I think I misplaced my phone." The doorman nodded respectfully before turning toward Ethan. "Thank you for bringing her home, sir." Ethan simply smiled. She looked like she needed a safe ride. Another employee hurried into the lobby while the doorman quietly explained what had happened. Ethan had no interest in listening. He gave Charlotte a small nod. "You are home now. Take care of yourself." She looked at him as though she wanted to say something more. "Will I ever see you again?" Ethan shrugged with a warm smile. "Portland is not that big." She laughed softly for the first time that evening. "No, I suppose it is not." Ethan returned to his truck and drove away before anyone offered him money or praise. By the time he reached his small white house on the edge of the neighborhood, the rain had become little more than a gentle mist. A porch light glowed warmly through the darkness. Lily was waiting inside exactly as he had expected. The moment he opened the front door, she ran toward him wearing oversized pajamas decorated with tiny blue stars. "Daddy, you are late." Ethan knelt to hug her. "I know. I had to help someone get home safely." Lily looked up with curious green eyes that reminded him so much of her mother. "Is she okay?" "I think she will be." Lily smiled with complete confidence. "Mom would have helped too." Ethan felt the familiar ache in his chest, softer than it used to be but never completely gone. "Yes," he whispered. "She definitely would have." The next morning sunlight spilled across the kitchen as blueberry pancakes filled the house with their sweet, familiar aroma. Lily laughed while trying to catch blueberries before they rolled off her plate. It was an ordinary Saturday, exactly the kind Ethan treasured. He believed ordinary days were life's greatest blessings. After breakfast he grabbed his keys and noticed something resting on the passenger floor of his truck. It was a delicate silver locket, polished despite years of use. He picked it up carefully, intending only to return it. When his thumb brushed the tiny clasp, the locket opened by accident. Inside was an old photograph of a smiling young woman standing beside an older lady beneath autumn maple trees. Ethan frowned. There was something strangely familiar about the older woman's gentle eyes, but before he could think any further his phone rang. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. He answered calmly. A composed female voice greeted him. "Good morning, Mr. Walker. My name is Olivia. I work for Miss Charlotte Hayes. She asked me to thank you personally and wondered if you might have found something she lost last night." Ethan looked once more at the silver locket resting quietly in his hand, completely unaware that returning it would become the first step toward uncovering a family story that had been waiting nearly a decade to be told. Monday morning arrived beneath a sky washed clean by the weekend rain, and Ethan Walker was already raising the first service bay door before most of Portland had finished its first cup of coffee. The familiar scent of rubber, steel, and fresh brewed coffee filled Walker Auto Repair as sunlight stretched across the concrete floor. Ordinary routines had always brought him peace. They asked nothing except honesty and steady hands. He placed Charlotte's silver locket inside a small envelope behind the front counter, determined to return it exactly as he had found it. A little after 9 o'clock, the sound of an engine unlike any that usually visited the shop rolled quietly into the parking lot. It was not flashy or loud, just an elegant dark gray luxury sedan that looked almost out of place beside pickup trucks and family minivans waiting for oil changes. A young woman stepped out first, dressed in a tailored navy suit and carrying a leather portfolio. She smiled politely as she approached the counter. "Good morning. I am Olivia. We spoke on the telephone." Ethan nodded and reached beneath the counter. "I believe this belongs to Miss Hayes." Before Olivia could answer, the passenger door opened again. Charlotte climbed out herself, dressed far more simply than the night they had met. She wore blue jeans, a cream-colored sweater, and very little makeup. Without the pressure of boardrooms or evening events, she looked younger and surprisingly approachable. "I wanted to thank you in person," she said. Ethan handed her the envelope. "I am glad it found its way back." Charlotte opened the locket carefully, relief softening her face the instant she saw it intact. She closed it gently and looked back at Ethan. "This belonged to someone very important to my family. I thought it was gone forever." Ethan smiled. "Then I am happy it is home." She reached into her purse, removed an envelope, and placed it on the counter. Ethan never looked inside. He quietly slid it back toward her. "There is no charge for returning something that already belongs to you." Charlotte blinked. "You drove me home. You protected my privacy. Now you refuse a reward." Ethan shrugged with the same calm expression she remembered from that rainy night. "My daughter reminds me every day that kindness loses something the moment it comes with a price tag." Charlotte stood silent for a moment. Olivia glanced between them, clearly unaccustomed to seeing anyone decline the gratitude of one of the city's most respected executives. Finally Charlotte smiled. "Then perhaps I owe you breakfast instead." Ethan laughed softly. "I already had breakfast. Blueberry pancakes. My daughter would never forgive me for skipping them." The warmth in his voice lingered long after the words ended. Charlotte noticed it. She had spent years surrounded by brilliant people, ambitious people, powerful people. She could not remember the last time she had met someone who seemed genuinely content with a simple life. As she prepared to leave, a small bicycle rolled around the side of the building. Lily stopped in front of the garage wearing her school backpack and bright yellow helmet. "Daddy, I forgot my science project." Ethan smiled immediately. "Good timing." He walked over, lifted the carefully decorated poster board from the truck bed, and handed it to her. Lily noticed Charlotte standing nearby. "Hi." Charlotte smiled back. "Hello?" Lily looked at Ethan with complete innocence. "Is she your new customer?" Ethan chuckled. "She came to pick up something she lost." Lily nodded thoughtfully before turning toward Charlotte. "Daddy always finds lost things." Charlotte felt an unexpected tightness in her chest. "Does he?" Lily smiled proudly. "He says people are never really lost if somebody still cares enough to look for them." For several seconds no one spoke. Even Olivia lowered her eyes. Charlotte looked at Ethan differently now, not because he had helped her, but because she could suddenly see the kind of father he had become. On the drive back downtown she held the silver locket in her hands without opening it. Instead she found herself thinking about a little girl who believed her father could help people find their way home. By late afternoon Charlotte canceled 2 meetings, something her assistant had almost never seen her do. She stared through the glass wall of her office overlooking the Willamette River before quietly saying, "Olivia, I need my car serviced." Olivia looked puzzled. "The dealership handled everything last week." Charlotte smiled faintly. "Then perhaps it only needs someone honest to take another look." Hundreds of miles away from the polished towers of the financial district, Ethan closed the garage for the evening completely unaware that a simple act of integrity had just become the reason one extraordinary woman was searching for another excuse to walk back into his ordinary world. 3 days later the familiar sound of Charlotte's luxury sedan rolled quietly into Walker Auto Repair once again, but this time she was not alone. An older woman stepped out of the passenger seat with graceful movements that carried quiet confidence rather than wealth. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and although she leaned lightly on a polished wooden cane, there was dignity in every step she took. Charlotte walked beside her with unusual gentleness, almost protective, something Ethan noticed immediately. "Good morning," Charlotte said with an easy smile that felt much more natural than their first meeting. "I hope we are not interrupting your work." Ethan wiped his hands with a clean shop towel before returning the smile. "Not at all. What seems to be the problem with the car?" Charlotte exchanged a playful glance with the older woman. "Honestly, I am not even sure there is one." Ethan laughed softly. "Then I suppose I should inspect it very carefully." The older woman smiled at his answer. That sounds like the kind of mechanic every town deserves. Ethan extended his hand. Ethan Walker. Margaret Bennett, she replied warmly. The name meant nothing to him, but something about her gentle voice stirred an unexplainable sense of familiarity. While Ethan slowly examined the sedan, Charlotte and Margaret wandered through the small waiting area. The garage was simple but spotless. Children's drawings decorated one wall beside framed certificates earned over years of honest work. A coffee maker quietly burbled in the corner beside homemade oatmeal cookies that Lily insisted customers should always have. Margaret studied every detail with quiet admiration. This place feels... She paused, searching for the right word. Lived in. Charlotte nodded. It feels peaceful. Their conversation stopped when Margaret noticed several framed family photographs resting on a wooden shelf behind the reception desk. One showed Ethan and Lily laughing beside a Christmas tree. Another captured the little girl holding a fishing pole almost as tall as she was. Then Margaret's eyes settled on a larger frame positioned in the center. It was a wedding photograph. Ethan stood beside a beautiful young woman wearing a simple lace gown beneath the golden leaves of an autumn afternoon. Margaret took one slow step. Closer. Then another. The smile disappeared from her face. Her fingers tightened around the curved handle of her cane. Charlotte noticed immediately. Are you all right? She asked quietly. Margaret did not answer. She could not. She stared at the young bride in the photograph as though time itself had stopped moving. Her breathing became shallow. Her eyes searched every familiar detail of the smiling face. The delicate curve of the smile. The tiny birthmark near her left eyebrow. The necklace resting against the wedding dress. Margaret reached toward the frame with trembling fingers but stopped just before touching the glass. No, she whispered almost silently. It cannot be. Charlotte looked from the photograph back to Margaret with growing concern. What is it? Before Margaret could answer, Ethan walked inside carrying a diagnostic tablet. Good news, he said cheerfully. Your car is in excellent condition. I could rotate the tires if you would like, but honestly there is nothing that needs repairing. His voice faded as he noticed Margaret standing motionless before the photograph. Miss Bennett? He asked gently. Margaret slowly turned toward him. Her eyes glistened with tears she was trying desperately to hold back. Who? She whispered. Who is the woman in this picture? Ethan's expression softened instantly. He walked over and lifted the frame with quiet care. My wife, he answered. Her name was Emily. She passed away 8 years ago. Silence settled over the garage. Outside, the wind stirred the American flag hanging beside the service bay, its quiet movement the only sound in the room. Margaret looked once more at Emily's smiling face. A single tear escaped despite every effort to stop it. Charlotte stepped closer, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. Mom? She asked softly, using the title she had always used despite years of emotional distance between them. Margaret slowly shook her head without taking her eyes off the photograph. I spent 20 years searching for my oldest daughter after she disappeared, she whispered. Every birthday, every Christmas, every single year. Ethan's smile slowly vanished as confusion replaced it. Margaret finally looked directly into his eyes, her voice breaking beneath the weight of decades of regret. Ethan, I believe your Emily was my daughter. The framed photograph slipped from Ethan's hands only an inch before he caught it again, but the tiny sound of wood striking the counter echoed through the silent garage with a force that seemed to stop time itself. For several long moments no one moved. The afternoon sunlight still streamed through the front windows of the garage, illuminating floating dust particles that seemed suspended in time, while the steady ticking of the wall clock suddenly became the loudest sound in the room. Ethan carefully set the photograph back onto the counter, as though it had become something far more fragile than wood and glass. He searched Margaret's face, hoping to find some explanation that would tell him he had misunderstood her words. Instead, he found only sorrow that looked far older than either of them. Charlotte gently guided her mother toward one of the waiting chairs. Mom, she whispered, please tell us what you mean. Margaret lowered herself slowly into the chair, folded both hands over the handle of her cane, and closed her eyes for a moment before speaking. "Before Charlotte was born, I had another daughter," she said quietly. "Her name was Emily Bennet." Ethan felt his heartbeat quicken. Margaret continued without looking up. "She was 19 when we had the worst argument of our lives. She wanted to leave home and build her own future. I believed she was making a terrible mistake. We both said things that should never have been said." Her voice trembled as she drew a careful breath. "The next morning she was gone." Charlotte stared in disbelief. "You told me my sister disappeared after college." Margaret nodded slowly. "That is what I wanted everyone to believe. The truth was harder. She left because I pushed too hard. Pride became more important than listening." Ethan remained silent. He remembered every story Emily had shared about growing up. She had spoken of foster families after she turned 20, of changing cities, of never finding the courage to return home because she believed she had already broken her mother's heart beyond repair. She had rarely spoken about her family, and whenever she did, sadness always replaced her smile. Margaret reached into her handbag and carefully removed a worn leather wallet. From inside she unfolded an old photograph whose edges had faded with time. It showed a teenage girl laughing beneath brilliant autumn leaves while holding the same silver locket Charlotte now wore around her neck. Ethan accepted the photograph with trembling hands. It was unmistakably Emily, younger by several years but carrying the same gentle smile that had first captured his heart. "She gave me that locket on my 16th birthday," Margaret whispered. "Inside I placed a picture of us together because I hoped she would always know she had a home." Charlotte slowly touched the locket resting against her sweater, her eyes filling with tears as she realized she had unknowingly carried a piece of another family's history for years. Ethan spoke for the first time since Margaret's revelation. "Emily told me she had no one left. She truly believed that." Margaret lowered her head. "Because I never found her." She swallowed hard before continuing. "I hired investigators. I searched shelters. I visited every address anyone suggested. Whenever I thought I was close, she had already moved somewhere else. Then the trail disappeared completely." Ethan looked toward the family photograph once more. "We met in Seattle," he said softly. "She was working at a community library. We married 2 years later. Lily was born the following spring." Margaret covered her mouth as quiet tears slipped down her cheeks. "I have a granddaughter." The words sounded less like a discovery than a prayer answered years too late. Charlotte reached over and gently held her mother's hand. The distance that had always existed between them suddenly seemed smaller. Ethan walked to a cabinet near his workbench and carefully removed a small wooden memory box. He had not opened it in months. He carried it back and placed it gently on the table. Inside were photographs, birthday cards, hospital bracelets, handwritten recipes, and neatly bundled letters Emily had written throughout their marriage. Resting on top was a sealed envelope addressed in her graceful handwriting. Across the front were 6 simple words. "If my family is ever found." Margaret stared at the envelope in complete silence. Ethan looked at the handwriting he knew by heart, realizing that even after all these years Emily had somehow prepared for a reunion she never lived to see. None of them reached for the envelope immediately. They simply looked at it together, understanding that whatever waited inside had the power to rewrite everything they believed they knew about the woman all 3 of them still loved. No one spoke as Ethan carefully lifted the sealed envelope from the memory box. The paper had yellowed slightly over the years, but Emily's handwriting remained graceful and unmistakable. His fingers lingered along the edge before he looked toward Margaret. "If this was written for your family," he said quietly, "then I think you should be here when I read it." Margaret nodded through silent tears. Charlotte moved her chair closer without saying a word. Outside, another customer pulled into the parking lot, but Ethan quietly turned the sign on the front door from open to back soon. For the first time since Emily had left this world, nothing felt more important than the words she had left behind. Ethan slowly opened the envelope and unfolded several neatly written pages. The first line alone was enough to bring a painful smile to his face. If you are reading this, then somehow life has done what I always prayed it might. His voice remained calm, although every sentence carried memories he had carefully protected for nearly a decade. To my family, wherever you may be, I do not know if you will ever forgive me for leaving home, but I hope one day you will understand that I never stopped loving you. Pride kept me away longer than distance ever did. Every birthday I wanted to call. Every Christmas I imagined knocking on your front door. I told myself I would come back after I had built a life worth sharing, but every year that passed made returning feel harder. Then I met Ethan. He taught me that people are not measured by what they own but by how gently they carry the hearts placed in their care. Together we built a home filled with laughter, simple dinners, and quiet hope. If you ever find him, please know that he was the greatest blessing of my life. If you ever meet our daughter Lily, tell her that kindness is the strongest inheritance I could ever leave behind. Ethan paused for several seconds before continuing. His voice had become softer, almost as though Emily herself were speaking through him. Please do not spend your lives searching for someone to blame. Life is already too short for that. If we are ever reunited, let it begin with forgiveness instead of regret. Margaret lowered her head into her hands. The weight she had carried for 20 years suddenly shifted from unbearable guilt into something gentler, though no less emotional. Charlotte quietly reached for another page lying beneath the letter. There is more, she whispered. Ethan nodded. The second sheet contained a handwritten family tree Emily had started after Lily was born. Beside Margaret's name, she had written a single sentence. One day I hope my daughter will know her grandmother's smile. Margaret covered her mouth as another tear escaped. She remembered me, she whispered. After everything, she still remembered me. Ethan looked toward the photographs spread across the table. She never stopped loving you. The room fell silent once again until Charlotte finally spoke. There has to be some official record that confirms everything. Hospital files. Birth certificates. Marriage records. Ethan nodded slowly. I still have every document Emily ever kept. Together they spent the next hour opening carefully labeled folders that had remained untouched for years. There was Emily's marriage certificate, Lily's birth certificate listing Emily Bennett Walker as her full legal name, and an old application for a replacement social security card that included the address where Emily had once lived with her mother. Margaret immediately recognized it. That was our home, she whispered. The maple tree was planted by my husband before Charlotte was born. Charlotte noticed another folded paper tucked inside the file. It was an obituary clipping from 8 years earlier. Margaret stared at the date with trembling hands. I never knew, she said quietly. I spent years searching for someone who had already slipped beyond my reach. Ethan gently closed the folder. She always hoped you would find each other someday. Margaret slowly stood and walked toward the framed wedding photograph once more. This time she rested her fingertips lightly against the glass. I cannot change the years we lost, she whispered. But perhaps I can still keep the promise she asked of me. Ethan followed her gaze to Emily's smiling face, while Charlotte quietly looked toward the family photographs of Lily scattered across the shelf. None of them noticed the sound of a small bicycle stopping outside the garage as the school day ended early, and moments later the front door began to open. Lily pushed the garage door open with both hands, balancing her science project against one shoulder, and wearing the same bright smile that had greeted Ethan every afternoon since kindergarten. Daddy, school ended early because the teachers had a meeting, she called cheerfully before noticing 3 unfamiliar faces standing silently inside the waiting area. Her smile softened into curious politeness. Ethan quickly walked toward her, taking the poster board from her hands. Perfect timing, sweetheart. Lily looked at Charlotte first and recognized her immediately. Hi. You came back. Charlotte smiled warmly. I told you your father was very good at helping people. Lily giggled. He is. Then her eyes drifted toward Margaret, whose expression had become impossible to hide. The older woman's eyes shimmered with tears as she watched the little girl standing only a few feet away. Emily's smile. Emily's eyes. Even the slight tilt of Lily's head reminded her of the daughter she had lost so many years before. Margaret slowly knelt despite the stiffness in her knees, bringing herself closer to Lily's height. "Hello?" she whispered. "Hello?" Lily answered politely. "My name is Lily Walker." Margaret's lips trembled into a fragile smile. "That is a beautiful name." Lily glanced toward Ethan. "Daddy, why is she crying?" Ethan took a slow breath, realizing there was no perfect way to explain what none of them had expected to discover only hours earlier. "Sometimes," he said gently, "people cry because they find something wonderful after believing it was gone forever." Lily considered his answer with the thoughtful seriousness only children seemed able to possess. Then she walked the last few steps toward Margaret. "My teacher says hugs help people feel better." She opened her arms without hesitation. Margaret froze. Years of regret, unanswered prayers, and quiet loneliness seemed to gather into that single innocent invitation. Carefully, almost fearfully, she wrapped her arms around Lily. The embrace lasted only a few seconds, yet for Margaret it felt like 20 lost years quietly melting away. When they stepped apart, Lily studied her face again. "You smell like cinnamon cookies." Margaret laughed softly through her tears. "I bake them every Sunday." Lily's eyes widened. "My mom used to bake cinnamon cookies with me." The words settled gently over the room. Ethan lowered his eyes, while Charlotte quietly pressed a hand against her heart. Margaret smiled through trembling lips. Maybe someday we could bake them together." Lily looked toward Ethan for permission. He nodded almost imperceptibly. "I would like that," Lily answered. A peaceful silence followed until Charlotte spoke carefully. "Lily, there is something we only learned today." She hesitated, searching for words gentle enough for a child. "Your mother had family she could never find again." Lily frowned slightly. "Like when someone gets lost?" Charlotte nodded. "Yes. Very much like that." Ethan stepped beside his daughter and rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart, we believe Miss Margaret is your mother's mother." Lily blinked once. Then again. She looked at Margaret, then back toward the framed wedding photograph resting on the counter. Finally she asked the simplest question in the room. "Does that mean—" She paused before smiling shyly. "Does that mean you are my grandma?" No one answered immediately. Margaret could not. She covered her mouth as tears rolled freely down her cheeks. Ethan quietly nodded instead. "Yes, sweetheart. We think she is." Lily looked back toward Margaret, her smile growing brighter with complete acceptance. Children rarely demanded complicated explanations when love stood plainly before them. She walked over once more, slipped her small hand into Margaret's trembling fingers, and said the single word the older woman had dreamed of hearing for decades. "Grandma." The garage became perfectly still. Even the sounds of traffic beyond the open service bay seemed to disappear. Charlotte quietly wiped tears from her own eyes as she watched her mother smile with a joy she had never witnessed before. Ethan looked toward Emily's photograph resting above the counter. For the first time in 8 years, grief no longer felt like the only thing waiting beneath her smile. It felt as though Emily had quietly kept one final promise, guiding the people she loved back to one another when they needed each other most. As Margaret gently held Lily's hand, Charlotte found herself watching Ethan from across the room. She realized that somewhere between a rainy night, a forgotten locket, and a little girl's extraordinary kindness, the walls around her own heart had begun to change in ways she had never expected, and that realization both comforted and frightened her. The weeks that followed unfolded with a gentleness none of them had expected. Saturday afternoons slowly became a new family tradition as Margaret arrived carrying warm cinnamon cookies wrapped in a blue checkered towel exactly as she had promised. Lily insisted on helping in the kitchen, covering herself with flour almost every visit while laughing so hard that even Ethan found himself smiling before he realized it. The little house that had once echoed mostly with quiet routines now carried the comforting sounds of conversation, baking timers, and stories that had waited decades to be shared. Margaret often found herself stopping in the hallway to study the framed photographs of Emily that lined the living room. She would smile, sometimes cry, and then whisper a quiet apology only she and her daughter could hear. Ethan never interrupted those moments. He understood that grief and healing often occupied the same space. Charlotte became a regular visitor as well, although she rarely announced her reasons. Sometimes she brought groceries after claiming she had purchased too much. Sometimes she appeared with a stack of children's books for Lily, insisting a company charity event had donated extra copies. Ethan recognized every excuse for what it truly was. She simply wanted to be there. One cool autumn evening, Charlotte remained behind after Margaret and Lily had gone inside to finish decorating cookies. Ethan sat on the front porch steps looking across the backyard where maple leaves drifted quietly onto the grass. Charlotte joined him carrying 2 mugs of hot apple cider. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Finally, Charlotte broke it with a quiet question. Do you ever feel guilty when life starts becoming happy again? Ethan looked down at the warm cup in his hands before answering. Every widow or widower probably asks that question. Charlotte waited patiently. For years, he continued, I thought smiling meant I was leaving Emily behind. Then one day Lily laughed so hard she nearly fell off a swing, and I realized something. Emily never wanted our home to become a museum. She wanted it to remain a family. Charlotte lowered her eyes. Sometimes I worry that getting closer to you dishonors her memory. Ethan turned toward her with gentle sincerity. Emily taught me how to love. She never asked me to stop living. Those words settled quietly between them as the porch light cast a warm circle across the wooden steps. Inside the house, Lily's laughter floated through the open kitchen window, followed by Margaret's cheerful voice reminding everyone not to eat the cookie dough before it reached the oven. Charlotte smiled. I have not heard my mother laugh like that since I was a little girl. Ethan glanced toward the window. Lily thinks she finally found the grandmother every kid deserves. Charlotte nodded slowly. I think my mother believes she found forgiveness she no longer thought was possible. A gentle breeze stirred the maple branches overhead. Charlotte hesitated before speaking again. There is something I have not admitted. Ethan listened quietly. When I first met you, I admired your kindness. Then I admired your strength. Somewhere along the way, I started looking forward to every reason I could invent to visit your garage. Ethan smiled softly, not with surprise but with quiet understanding. I noticed. Charlotte laughed through slight embarrassment. You did? The luxury sedan has been inspected 5 times in 1 month. They both laughed, the sound light and genuine. Then Ethan's expression became thoughtful. Charlotte, whatever happens next, I do not want it to happen because of grief or gratitude. I want it to happen because it is honest. She met his eyes with calm certainty. That is exactly why I am still here. Through the kitchen window, Margaret happened to glance outside. She saw them sitting together beneath the porch light, not holding hands, not making promises, simply sharing peaceful conversation. Tears gathered once more, but this time they carried no sorrow. She quietly picked up Emily's framed photograph from the kitchen counter and whispered with a grateful smile, Your family is finding its way forward, sweetheart. At that exact moment, Lily looked up from decorating cookies and noticed her grandmother speaking softly to the photograph. Grandma, she asked innocently, do you think Mom can see us? Margaret looked toward the smiling picture before answering with complete conviction. I think she already knows exactly where home is. Nearly 1 year later, the first Saturday of October arrived beneath a sky painted with brilliant shades of amber and gold. The maple trees surrounding Ethan's little home looked almost exactly as they had in the old wedding photograph that still rested on the living room mantel. Some things had changed beyond recognition, while others had remained beautifully the same. The scent of cinnamon, fresh coffee, and homemade apple pie drifted through the open windows as family and close friends gathered quietly in the backyard. There were no expensive decorations, no grand stage, and no reporters despite Charlotte's position in the business world. She had insisted on something simple because Ethan had taught her that the most meaningful moments were never measured by how much they cost. Lily hurried across the yard carrying a small basket filled with autumn leaves she had collected that morning. "Everything is ready," she announced proudly. Margaret smiled as she adjusted the collar of Lily's cream-colored dress. "Your mother would have loved today." Lily looked toward the familiar photograph resting on a nearby table beside fresh flowers. "I think she already does." Margaret gently squeezed her granddaughter's hand. Months earlier those words would have filled her with regret. Now they filled her with gratitude. She had not been given the chance to raise Emily through adulthood, but life had unexpectedly offered her another chance to love the family Emily left behind. Ethan stood quietly beneath the old maple tree wearing a simple navy suit, looking far more nervous than he had expected. Charlotte walked toward him wearing an elegant ivory dress that reflected the afternoon sunlight without extravagance. When she reached him, neither of them spoke immediately. They simply smiled, understanding how unlikely this moment had once seemed. Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small velvet box but paused before opening it. "There is something I need to say first," he began softly. "For a long time I believed loving again meant leaving part of my life behind. Then I realized love does not replace love. It makes room for more of it." Charlotte's eyes filled with quiet tears. Ethan continued, "Emily will always be part of my story because she helped shape the man standing here today. And because of that, I believe she would want me to keep building the family we dreamed about." Charlotte gently nodded. "I never wanted to take anyone's place. I only hoped one day I might deserve a place beside you." Ethan smiled. "You already have one." Margaret stepped forward carrying a small wooden box she had carefully restored over the past several months. She opened it slowly, revealing Emily's wedding ring resting inside on a white satin cloth. Everyone became silent. Margaret looked first toward Ethan, then toward Charlotte. "This ring belongs to my daughter," she said quietly. "It will always belong to her. I am not giving it away to replace her memory." She gently closed the lid and handed the box to Lily instead. "One day, if you choose, it will remain part of your mother's story." Lily accepted it with both hands, holding it close to her heart. Margaret then reached into her pocket and removed another ring, one that had belonged to her own mother for generations. She placed it into Ethan's hand. "This," she whispered, "is for new beginnings." Ethan slipped the ring onto Charlotte's finger as tears and smiles quietly spread across every face gathered beneath the autumn branches. No applause interrupted the moment. No music rushed to fill the silence. The wind gently stirred the maple leaves overhead as though nature itself wished to honor the quiet dignity of what had taken place. Lily looked from Ethan to Charlotte before asking the question everyone secretly hoped to hear. "Can I call you Mom someday?" Charlotte knelt beside her, brushing a loose curl away from Lily's face. "Only when you are ready," she answered. Lily smiled brightly. "I think I already am." Charlotte embraced her with tears of joy while Ethan looked toward Emily's photograph one final time. The sorrow that had once accompanied that familiar smile had finally given way to peace. He quietly whispered, "Thank you." As the afternoon sunlight settled over 3 generations gathered around one table, Margaret realized that miracles rarely arrived with flashing lights or extraordinary wealth. Sometimes they arrived through an ordinary man who stopped his truck on a rainy night because he refused to drive past someone who needed kindness. And in choosing compassion over convenience, Ethan Walker had unknowingly led a broken family back to one another, proving that dignity, grace, forgiveness, and second chances have a remarkable way of finding those who never stop believing that love can still bring people home.